Mo Meaning Mondays number 12. So on page 12 of Maps of Meaning, Jordan finally breaks out the famous Dostoevsky piano key quotation that he often refers to. And this always reminds me of the scene in The Matrix where I believe Agent Smith is explaining to Morpheus the various ways that the Matrix was formed at the beginning. And the first way the machines tried to capture the mind of man was through creating an artificial paradise where all his needs and wants were met. But he said that man kept waking up because our primitive brains couldn't accept that as the true reality. I guess it resembled too much of a dream world. It's interesting how he's telling that to Morpheus, someone named Morpheus. And so they had to alter their simulated world and make it more realistic to allow man to suffer. And that seemed to solve that problem of people waking up from what appeared to be a dream world. So whenever I read that quotation from Dostoevsky, I just can't help but hear that speech from Agent Smith's, in the background as well. And it's here in page 12 and 13 that Jordan is finally summing up where we've been as human beings, where we are, and he's trying to give us a hint of where we need to go, a direction. He's trying to orient us on his map. And I think what's obviously really important regarding that is he says that right at the end here that there's a way of overcoming the age-old problem of deriving the ought from the is. Help us see what we must do might be inextricably associated with what it is that we are. And so I'm going to read, this page, since this is week 12, I'm doing page 12, but it obviously runs over onto page 13. So I'm going to go back to slide 2. And so he introduces the quote by Dostoevsky. And so Dostoevsky writes, "Now I ask you, what can be expected of man since he is being endowed with such strange qualities? Shower upon him every earthly blessing, drown him in a sea of happiness, so that nothing but bubbles of bliss can be seen on the surface. Give him economic prosperity, such that he should have nothing else to do but sleep, eat cakes, and busy himself with the continuation of his species. And even then, out of sheer ingratitude, sheer spite, man would play you some nasty trick. He would even risk his cakes, and would deliberately desire the most fatal rubbish, the most uneconomical absurdity, simply to introduce into all this positive good sense his fatal fantastic element. It is just his fantastic dreams, his vulgar folly, that he will desire to retain, simply in order to prove to himself, as though that were so necessary, that men still are men, and not the keys of a piano, which the laws of nature threaten to control so completely that soon one will be able to desire nothing but by the calendar. And that is not all. Even if man really were nothing but a piano key, even if this were proved to him by natural science and mathematics, even then he would not become reasonable, but would purposely do something perverse out of simple ingratitude, simply to gain his point. And if he does not find means, he will contrive destruction and chaos, will contrive sufferings of all sorts, only to gain his point. He will launch a curse upon the world, and as only man can curse, it is his privilege, the primary distinction between him and other animals. Maybe by his curse alone he will attain his object, that is, convince himself that he is a man and not a piano key. If you say that all this, too, can be calculated and tabulated, chaos and darkness and curses, so that the mere possibility of calculating it all beforehand would stop it all, and reason would reassert itself, then man would purposely go mad in order to be rid of reason and gain his point. I believe in it. I answer for it. For the whole work of man really seems to consist in nothing but proving to himself every minute that he is a man and not a piano key. It may be at the cost of his skin. It may be by cannibalism. And this being so, can one help being tempted to rejoice that it has not yet come off, and that desire still depends on something we don't know? And something else that kind of struck me as I read this is the semi-recent article by Harari saying that we have to give up our notion of free will if we're going to survive the next century or something, as big corporations and government gain control of very sophisticated artificial intelligence, which will know us more than we know ourselves. I kind of mentioned that a while back. So there's someone who is perhaps convinced that he's nothing but a piano key. Although I think if I'm going to Iron Man his argument, I would say that maybe he thinks that we're sufficiently similar to a piano key that the workings of the AI would have a big enough effect that it could negatively affect humanity. The other thing that struck me here is the case of Sam Harris, of course, because Jordan obviously had those 4 discussions with him, and Matt Dillahunty as well, and those like him. They think they're piano keys, and I've never understood Sam Harris's exact point here about determination and the lack of free will. But if it is what it seems, then he would be agreeing that he's nothing but a piano key. And what Jordan kept trying to point out is that Sam Harris and Matt Dillahunty seem to be saying that they're nothing but piano keys, and that the rest of us are also similarly mechanistic and determined. And I think, of course, to some degree we are, but their point seems to be stronger, that we are totally determined. And if that's the case, what Jordan was trying to bring up to Sam Harris was that even with all your rationality, even if you can mathematically prove it, as Dostoevsky says right here, by natural science and mathematics, man would still come up with destruction and chaos and sufferings of all sorts to prove that he's still a man. And Dostoevsky brings up very interesting language, as Jordan talked about in the Ayn Rand Institute talk. He talks about a curse. He talks about chaos and darkness. And these are things that are not scientific. They're not mathematical. You cannot calculate this. You cannot tabulate it, as Dostoevsky says. And even if you could, because Dostoevsky tries to Iron Man this himself, he says man would just simply go mad just to prove his point. And so Jordan was trying to say over and over again, he was trying to drive the point home to Sam Harris, that your God of reason can never run the world, because human beings are not essentially reasonable, they're not essentially logical, and they use that as a tool, and if you think it's the ultimate tool, then it might be the ultimate tool of destruction. So now I'll move on to the next paragraph. This is Jordan writing now after the Dostoevsky quote. We also presently possess in accessible and complete form the traditional wisdom of a large part of the human race, possess accurate description of the myths and rituals that contain and condition the implicit and explicit values of almost everyone who has ever lived. These myths are centrally and properly concerned with the nature of successful human existence. Careful comparative analysis of this great body of religious philosophy might allow us to provisionally determine the nature of essential human motivation and morality if we were willing to admit our ignorance and take the risk. And I think this is what he was trying to get Sam to do in those 4 discussions. Just admit your ignorance and take the risk. Walk down this road with me, and I can show you what I know. But Sam was unwilling to take the risk. He was unwilling to admit his ignorance. And I love the way Jordan has very carefully worded this. He's very carefully trying to lay out his project right in this paragraph and inform the reader exactly how he's going to achieve his goals. It's because we presently possess in accessible and complete form the traditional wisdom of a large part of the human race, possess accurate description of the myths and rituals that contain and condition the implicit and explicit values of almost everyone who's ever lived. And in previous pages, he went over the importance between the implicit and the explicit, how we explicitly say one thing and we often implicitly live out, we act out in the world of action, another thing, something that we may not be explicitly saying that we believe, or we might not explicitly hold as a value, and yet we're acting it out in our daily lives. So we have all of this knowledge, so now we have to do a careful comparative analysis of this great body of religious philosophy, and this might allow us to, note the word provisionally, determine the nature of essential human motivation and morality. Human motivation and morality. Those are the two things that he believes are necessary for living in the world of action, because your motivations are only good insofar as they are telling you how to act in the world. They're giving you a motor output, and the morality is the sense of value that you give to the things in the world. If we were willing to admit to our ignorance and take the risk, so there's a risk involved. This reminds me of sort of like, in some weak way, the Kierkegaardian leap of faith that he talks about, again, in a very weak way. You might say this is a scientific way of saying it, of laying out in a sort of psychological, anthropological, philosophical way, something that Kierkegaard laid out in a very much a religious way. Accurate specification of underlying mythological commonalities might comprise the first developmental stage in the conscious evolution of a truly universal system of morality. Boy, that's another sentence he probably wrote 30 times. Accurate specification of underlying mythological commonalities. So what are the common threads that are being woven through all the myths that we have come across, that we know of, that might, that's kind of a weak word, that might comprise the first developmental stage in the conscious evolution of a truly universal system of morality. The conscious evolution of... That reminds me of the book he often cites, that I've mentioned a few times myself, The Origins and History of Consciousness, by Erich Neumann, because Erich Neumann does examine the myths. And when I read the book for the first time, I felt very lost, because I did not have such a depth and breadth of knowledge of world mythology. And he just goes from one place in the world to the next, from one era to the next, and he goes, deep into these myths and understanding them. And if you don't even know the basic, sketch of the myth, you might find yourself to be lost. The second time around was a little bit better for me because I understood where he was going with it. But I still want to read a few books on world mythology to get that kind of knowledge for myself. But here, this is what Jordan's talking about. I'm sure that this Origins and History of Consciousness was one of the bedrocks for Jordan's Maps of Meaning, as well as, the other works I often cite by Northrop Frye. So he goes on to say, the establishment of such a system, acceptable to empirical and religious minds alike, could prove of incalculable aid in the reduction of intrapsychic, inter-individual, and intergroup conflict. And here's Jordan's main goal as a doctor. Carl Jung called himself, as a psychologist, a doctor of the soul. And I never heard that. I never heard psychology or physician, a psychologist, expressing what he does in those terms. I find it very appealing, being a physician of the soul. And so here, the establishment of such a system, acceptable to empirical and religious minds alike. So this is, he brought this up in page 1 and 2, how the scientific and religious domains are not quite delineated enough, and you have to be careful not to confuse them and mix them up. But so this is something he thinks that both camps can agree to, which I find interesting. Could prove of incalculable aid to the reduction of intrapsychic, interindividual, and intergroup conflict. There's the reduction in harm, the reduction in evil. This is how Jordan almost opened up the book in his preface. He was worried about the self-destruction of the human race. And so how could you reduce the risk for humanity? How can you reduce the risk for individuals, for communities, for everybody involved here? And so he says intrapsychic, interindividual, and intergroup conflict. It's very much the physician in him. The grounding of such a comparative analysis within a psychology, or even a neuropsychology, I guess if you think psychology is too pseudoscience, maybe the neuropsychology is more biologically based, informed by strict empirical research, might offer us the possibility of a form of convergent validation and help us overcome the age-old problem of deriving the ought from the is. Help us see how what we must do might be inextricably associated with what it is that we are. I'll just point out that the idea here, he says, of the possibility of a form of convergent validation. He sort of brought this up a lot in the beginning of his biblical series on how what his method is, and he tries to analyze things on many different layers, and if the things converge, it's a sign of what he's looking at is valid, that his process is valid, and that he's going to get a true result. And if you only look at something from in sort of one lens and one layer, or two, the odds of your getting the truth of the thing is much less than if you're layering on 5 or 6 or 8 different kinds of things you're looking at, and if they sort of converge into that one thing you're looking for, it allows you a greater odds of success at finding the truth. And so that's what I think is, now he's clearly defined where we have been, what we are, what we're doing, and where we ought to go. He's going to try to help us overcome the age-old problem of deriving the ought from the is. This is something that Sam Harris apparently thinks he's done, but Jordan, after reading all of Sam Harris's work, thinks that Sam hasn't really gotten it. Sam, I think, from what I know of his work, I personally haven't read it. Some of my friends are huge fans of his, and they read all his stuff. And with my discussions with them, it doesn't seem like Sam has considered all the different layers that Jordan has considered. It doesn't seem like there's much convergence happening to validate Sam's thought processes. And there seems to be a lot more convergence happening in maps of meaning with Jordan Peterson. And I know that just from these few pages, and also from examining the index like I did in the first Mo Meaning week number 1. So that's all I have for this week, and next week, we're going to start diving into some more exciting things, in my opinion, because he's been unraveling. Of course, when you first start such a book, there's so much that you have to prepare, and you have to lay down a small foundation and expand it gradually, so that the reader can keep up with your thoughts. And I feel like it's flowing better, and it's expanding very nicely, and it's keeping my interest, of course. Only 12 and a half pages in. So if you like this sort of thing, please hit the like button and subscribe. Thank you.